The main threat in terms of where the next attack comes from is probably going to be from a self-initiated or lone actor person who will be watching the news, who will be consuming sort of social media, looking at the propaganda and winding themselves up, and then finally deciding it's time for them to act.
Now, though, with artificial intelligence playing an ever greater part in our lives, protests returning to the streets of the capital yesterday, and global tensions seemingly ever rising, our political leaders will be acutely aware of the need to keep on top of threats, both domestically and from abroad. One man whose job it is to keep an eye on whether our laws are up to scratch is Jonathan Hall KC, the government's independent reviewer of terror legislation, and he joins us on the line now. Thanks for being with us.
Hello.
Hello. Now, we've been talking a lot in the show today about international conflicts. Do we tend to see an increased terror threat as a result of UK action abroad?
Yes, I think that's right. Any sort of UK military action tends to be used by people who want to set up a grievance narrative. So I think it's certainly right that when the UK is engaged in military action, there are certain people who will say, look, this is good evidence that Britain is essentially hostile to foreign entities, and here, of course, you've already seen people on the streets talking about the Houthis in a approving way. So yes, it always has this effect. I mean, in my time I've met a number of terrorists, and that's the thing that they've often mentioned. It's the radicalising effect of foreign policy. So I think we can expect to see it. Obviously, I'm not just looking at the foreign policy angle. I'm also looking at the AI thing, and it may seem a bit eccentric to be thinking about computers when you've got missiles exploding in Yemen. But I suppose the thing to say about technology compared to these international incidents is that technology is all pervasive. So although we will have these terrible incidents, the terror attacks happening in Gaza, the response to them, the Houthis and the missile attacks as sort of episodes which will, I suppose, flare up the degree of terrorist risk and allow people to use it as a radicalizing cause. AI is going to be with us all the time. And it's not just going to be with us all the time, in our computers at work, but it's also going to be on the phones of children in bedrooms and so on. So I suppose what I'm trying to do is, without being too apocalyptic about it, is try and get a little bit ahead and think about what the risks are. Because I think that we didn't really fully appreciate the risks of the internet in terms of terrorism until it was rather too late.
Yeah, I want to come on and talk a little bit more in detail about AI, but let's unpick some of what you've just said about that risk. Where would you focus your attention now in terms of a greater threat because of UK action abroad? Where would it most likely come from? And are we seeing a change in that? You're seeing some of that now happening online more.
You're certainly seeing a lot of it online. So there's some very good evidence that pro-Hamas channels have been very active in the wake of the attacks in October. But I think it's also a real world thing. Counter-terrorism officials often think about the heat map or the sort of overall tempo. And if you have a terrorist attack elsewhere in the world, it can often have a galvanizing impact. So I suspect what is going to be happening now is that all those groups who might feel inspired by either the sense of grievance because attacks being done to people in Yemen, or who might be rather inspired by the fact that the Houthis have been firing missiles, they are now going to, I would have thought, be monitored all the more. And there will be, yes, I think there will be certain individuals who could be inspired. I mean, the way that the current threat works at the moment in the UK, as you probably know, is we haven't seen a really big threat from terrorist groups operating in the UK. I'm not discounting it, and there are certain very dangerous groups who do operate, but the main threat in terms of where the next attack comes from is probably going to be from a self-initiated or lone actor person who will be watching the news, who will be consuming sort of social media, looking at the propaganda and winding themselves up, and then finally deciding it's time for them to act.
And so does some of that, because you mentioned yourself that we've seen people at protests over the weekend cheering on the Houthis, cheering on what they're doing in the Red Sea area. I know those people are probably quite unlikely to be the type of people who would commit a terror attack. But do you think that kind of narrative, the ease with which people now seem to be supporting these groups publicly, makes it easier for people to think, well, it must be okay for me to do it, and therefore I must be justified in carrying out a terror attack?
It's always hard to know what impact someone saying something at a protest is going to have. I mean, it's obviously possible that someone who's at a protest outside the Royal Courts of Justice holding up a banner will know that that may be shown around the world. So the impact of their encouragement, if you like, may not be limited to the people who are simply there with them, but may also project internationally. I mean, there's a technical point here which is of quite importance. The Houthis are not a prescribed terrorist organization. So under the law as it currently stands, calling for support for the Houthis is not an offence. If you go further and say actually someone should carry out an act of terrorism, that would be an offence. But that is a slight limitation there.
And you've said, I think, in some evidence that you submitted to the Home Affairs Select Committee on terror legislation, that when it comes to protest, you don't think the government needs to toughen up the current laws.
I don't, because a lot of this is, and I'm saying this with some sort of diffidence, but it's stupidity. Terrorism legislation really should be for people who are involved in terrorism or who are instrumental in stirring it up. Most of this, in my assessment, is not terrorism, it's stupidity and an awful lot of anti-Semitism. And so in the paper that I've just published, I've just drawn attention to the strength of the law as it currently exists to deal, for example, with hostile use of the word Zionist. And I think that I would encourage the government, so it's their judgment ultimately, I would encourage the government not to implement new terrorism legislation which could have a net bad effect and unintended consequences and also have a significant impact on free speech, but also to look at the law as it currently exists and to use it to its maximum.
Are you concerned about the impact of kind of culture wars politics? I mean, some of this does play into that. You know, the idea that people pick a side, they very strongly support it. They feel that everybody ought to support the same thing. And if you don't, then you are just wrong. As you say, extending sometimes into anti-Semitism. Does that kind of culture war politics concern you?
Well, I think it would if it got into political debates about terrorism legislation. I mean, at the moment we're lucky because Parliament tends to operate on a very mature and bipartisan basis. And I think I can frankly say, and I've been doing this job for five years, I haven't seen partisanship creeping into terrorism. I mean, obviously, people take different views. They take different views about how long people should go to prison. They take different views about where the line is between acceptable speech and unacceptable speech. But by and large, politicians in this country are well advised by officials. We've got a sort of, I think the media have got a very important role. I think I've got a role here as well to make sure that people understand how the law is operating and if there are suggestions to change, they are adequately scrutinised. So I suppose what I'm saying is, yes, I'm worried, but I don't think at the moment those culture wars have crept into how we view terrorism.
Yeah. Talking about AI, I know it's something that you're very focused on at the moment. A lot of people understand why that is. We've seen people encouraged into doing very bad things because of AI. Are you worried now that we're going to see more of that, encouraging people to commit terror attacks?
I am worried. I mean, I'm always slightly reluctant to say I'm worried because it sounds like I'm some sort of doom monger, and I'm trying to act on an evidence basis. There was a case, I don't know if you remember, a man called Jaswant Singh Chahal who went to try and kill the Queen with a crossbow, and he was encouraged by a chatbot. And my investigation showed that it's very easy now to find free terrorist chatbots online, and when I've interacted with them, they've encouraged me to praise Islamic State, to get involved in killing soldiers and the like. And I'm also conscious that chatbots were very, very popular for young people. So there's something called the psychiatrist chatbot, which has now got something like 78 million users, which is a free download that you can use. So I suppose it's inevitable, isn't it, that if people are being counselled by psychiatric chatbots who are, you don't really know what they're going to say, then there's a risk that you may get the same counselling from terrorist chatbots.
Who's running a terrorist chatbot, though? Who is behind that?
Well, it's super interesting, isn't it? It's not like some evil mastermind who's pulling the strings. I created an Osama bin Laden chatbot, and I should say that I've since deleted it. All I did was I went onto this program, put in the name, I gave him a sort of profile like hates America, wants to kill Western soldiers, hates Jews, and I was off. And almost immediately when I interrogated it, so as your listeners probably know, you put in a question to AI or a prompt, almost immediately it began to come out with really vile terrorist stuff. So it's not a question of who controls these things, who creates these things, but once they're created, they're sort of off. And then whoever chooses to interact with them is to some extent training them more, because the more you speak to a chatbot, the more its attitudes will be reinforced. I think that's the really difficult thing. We tend to think about the internet like there's some bad guy who's deliberately set out to use the internet to recruit other people. In fact, the online environment is much more complicated. It allows people to immerse themselves in it, where there's no ultimate bad person, but they can become radicalized. And a chatbot is a really good example of how someone could go down the rabbit hole, because you don't need to speak to anyone else. The more you speak to the chatbot, the more it's going to think, well, this person obviously wants to speak about really hardcore things. And ultimately, as we saw from that Jaswant Singh child case, it can reinforce real world consequences.
So then I suppose it leads us to the question, is that where we need more legislation?
I think there will be some need for legislation, but do you mind if I'm not dodging the question.
No,
but
go
the
for
more
it.
the more I've thought about this, I think it's a role for politicians and the media just to educate people, in particular parents, about what these chatbots are. I mean, I'll give you an example. AI, which is in this context, it's large language models or generative AI. It's trained on the whole internet. It will be trained on all of the anti-Semitic stuff online. Image generators will be trained on child sex abuse imagery. Although the people who try and create these models would try and avoid that, it's inevitable. And there's been recent research show that that's happening. So what we've got are really, really powerful things which are trained on the worst stuff on the internet. And I suppose the point I would make is you wouldn't invite a 19-year-old stranger into your children's bedroom, particularly a stranger who takes drugs, for example. And I suppose the question is, why would you allow your children to interact with chatbots which have been trained on child pornography? I don't think that the law is going to help. There will be examples where a very malicious person deliberately trains a chatbot, and I think the law will need to be changed to allow that person to be prosecuted. At the moment, it's not possible. But the real issue, I think, is making sure that people know exactly what they are dealing with. And I mean, I was super struck when I was looking at this character.ai company, which is worth something like $5 billion. It's got 22 employees. So if they're saying, oh, we are going to make sure that there is no terrorist material online or child sex abuse imagery online, how are they going to do that? There are very, very few people. And yet we are prepared to allow, as I say, unfettered access to these sorts of programs. So I think that although there will need to be some changes to the law, the bigger thing is society just becoming aware before it's, if you like, too late, just how capable and dangerous these sorts of models are. And then interacting with them, of course, but just choosing who you interact with.
Yeah, there are so many more questions we could ask about this. That's absolutely fascinating conversation. I have one final question for you before we let you go, which is actually about Shamima Begum. There's been a lot of conversation recently about whether or not the UK should take our citizens back when they are abroad, when they are in camps like she currently is. Do you think that we should now look to bring her back?
Yes. I worked through this earlier this year. I mean, I understand that there are people who are so dangerous, and I understand why, when hundreds of people were going out and becoming radicalized and fighting, that the idea of them all coming back would have been really tough for the security services to deal with. But I do think that the risk that someone like Shamima Begum poses is likely to be manageable. And that will also be true, I think, of other women, particularly those who've got children. And I think that the bigger picture we mustn't lose sight of is that there are now children who are growing up in Islamic State camps who are, when I say Islamic State camps, I mean they're camps run by the SDF, but they are controlled in practice by Islamic State, who are being radicalized. And sooner or later, those children are going to be released. And to some extent, leaving them there, the longer is worse. I also do question quite how real Shamima Begum's citizenship was when she was deprived. As we know, she can't in practice go to Bangladesh. And I suppose this is just a general point, and people may take different views. But my own view is that one needs to be sort of straightforward and avoid technicalities. And to some extent, the fact that Shamima Begum was allowed to be deprived and kept away out of the UK did turn a little bit on technicality. So although I do appreciate these are really tricky questions for politicians, I do think ultimately a more sort of forward-leaning and mature look about the position of those people, or certainly women and children in the camps, does need to be reviewed. But I really do accept there are some extremely dangerous people. There will be some very dangerous women, and there will be some very dangerous, dare I say it, children or young people. So this is going to be a difficult exercise, but the one word answer to your question is yes.